In the theory of the Luciferian religion, such as the promotion of Baphomet, such as the human animal hybrids, which accelerates the presumption of the rams and the sheep, etc., in this utopia of hybrid animals, generates the assertion amongst the normal behavior of goats and rams, which includes the position of constantly posturing against each other, such as hitting each other's heads together, clashing their horns, in order to assert dominance and mating rights, etc. And in this position, you have the assertion of those who have adapted it spiritually into their core psyche, which generates the pretense of their attacks against those who have been exploitable by the temporary manipulations, which are designed to be made permanent so that those who would not have been in this category could accelerate by cutting in line, generating their hyperacceleration. And in that hyperacceleration, the larger horns become the smaller horns by function of lack of use, as the automation of the system of cutting in line becomes the primary mechanism of the horn, making the physical horns less consistently relevant. And thus, the theory from their position on the foundation of evolution generates the function of practice, and thus the small horns versus the large horns. The old saying, um, the tough make a bunch of resources, which are then exploited by the weak, which then loses everything, which then generates the tough. And this generates the consistent cycle of the curse of the third generation, as you have the original who has to have the large posturing horns, and then you have the second generation, which is consistently trying to maintain it by simply not losing it. They're not creating anything, they're just sustaining it. And then you have the third generation of posturing fools who don't actually have any contribution and don't want to be a part of the family business, and thus collapse as the third generation consumes and exploits all of the resources at the hyperinflated value. As the nature of society engages in inflation, the value that they're consuming is less, and thus, um, having not created it like the large horns or sustained it like the middle horns, the small horns are then completely destitute, and their posterity are compelled to grow larger horns through harsher and harsher struggles. And thus, the pretense of this being continued exponentially creates the larger structure of that society for that hierarchy of sustaining past the third generation, which requires the consistent reliance on that system of subversion. And thus, those that would inherently defeat them would actively be targeted and undermined by their various abuses, which they would create secrets in order to engage in subversions. And these secret subversions we can call magic or hate crimes or whatever you will. And thus, the mechanism is consistently protected by their abuses, and thus you engage in the function of their obligation of expansion or manifestation, which generates the posterity of consistently having to push out anyone who would have been the significant parties in the free market. And since the subversion is the primary function, then by definition, those parties aren't allowed to engage in the things, which generates the pretense of the permanent network of consistent abuse, undermining the competition in the defense of the posterity of the small horns, which becomes the standard function being enforced. And thus, the small horns look like they're posturing large horns, but could never actually win in unfair fight, and thus the engagement in the fair contest is forfeited by that subversion. And thus the engagement requires them to have engaged in the discipline, to have competed at that level, which they would not do because they don't have to do it, and thus the mechanism becomes the subtle degrading of the mechanism of them conducting the minimum amount of activity in order to have succeeded. And in that action are compared in the free market as inferior to the competition, as the status quo function of the nephew of the boss, who's a kind of derper idiot, still has to be promoted on the basis of being related to the boss. And thus, this systemically weakens the collective society and each organization and company. And thus, the injury to the collective society and mentality is permanently devastated by this satanic mentality, which is specifically designed on purpose as a mechanism to collapse that society of line cutters. And thus, you generate the normal poisons and subversions in those tricks, such as their active promotion of growth hormones, sex hormones, and the rest of them, which are conducted, such as uh, the Confederates in California, who are systemically targeting children with the surveillance system to conduct their dominatrix pedophilia abuses, as the assumption from the female Gnosticism is that the children are the collective property of the community and not of the parents, and thus those who even claim the position of parents' rights are still ignoring it in favor of the collective ideal so that they can have many of the latitudes against their children which they would have had to have earned normally, which they skipped in favor of the collective identity of the white supremacists in their mechanisms of cutting a line. Instead of the function of solid discipline in any particular mechanism, the easy way out is always the immediate decision. And that is their collective social subliminal identity. So if you ever engaged in a conversation with someone with those delusions, you would have to acknowledge their offenses which they're trying to ignore in their delusion. And thus the side effects of their crimes must be acknowledged. And the side effects of their crimes is the disqualification of the competition that they would be referring to, as they, having engaged in subversion, are not fit for the actual competition, which they would have lost otherwise, which is the purpose of the subversion. And thus you have the attacks, such as the position of the growth hormones, which is systematically stunting growth and the various bodily functions, such as their active push for the trans community to take over children, um, when they engage in the secret surveillance system. The secret records are barred evidence from the court from being examined, and thus the general society isn't allowed to understand the most fundamental aspect, as they censor and edit it enough in order to express their collective identity and the social statements which they say in fraud and bad faith, which are disqualified by that definition. So if they could stunt someone's growth and they become 4'3" after the stunting, but they would have been 6'2" normally, then the competition without the forfeit is the 6'2" version. And thus the normal competitors of the small horns being 5'10", we'll say, it's a perfectly acceptable height. They're not 6'2", they're just acceptable. And thus in that mechanism would have, in the relation of the contests, leveraging their bodies and their heights as a mechanism, would have lost to the taller party, and thus needed the poisons in order to keep the party at the 5'3" or whatever. And in that action, disqualified themselves from the contest, barring them from competing, forfeiting to the party which they have undermined by their activity of cheating, or magic, or whatever you have to call their subversion of the contest, as an attack on the ability to engage in a contest, posturing for position in the hierarchy. Their crimes are a forfeiting of their place in that contest, asserting their victims to the higher position in that hierarchy by virtue of the forfeit. Or you undermine the very construct of having the contest in the first place, and thus the mechanism of win by forfeit generates the positions in general society, as the criminals have to pay for their injuries against the parties that they have victimized, and thus hyper-accelerate them into those positions for having to compensate them for what they would have been doing in the obstruction, and thus the advantage in the competition would have normally been a certain grade and level with repercussions, which then is subverted by the tampering, which has to be paid for in the replacement. And thus, in that mechanism, the position that they have engaged in the forfeit cannot be the excuse for them to have won and postured against the remedy, which is the function standard rules in any system with hierarchies that are stable and may continue to exist. Thus, their position stating as fraud that the person didn't even do this, TM sidebar, because I cheated and totally restrained them, isn't really an argument. You yourself or you hired another party to restrain the activities, assumes the existence of the activity, and thus, in the state of law, it would have happened without the crime, and thus, by definition, in that acknowledgement, it legally would have happened and must be compensated for. And thus, the existence of the crime cannot be the excuse for the side effect to have been in their profit. The profit from the crime must be revoked and be subjugated to additional prohibitive fines. The white supremacist communism engaged in the charismatic socialism is using these secret subversions in order to undermine the social connections, which is its own branch of contest. And in that branch of contest, the subversion creates the offense by the inferior option, which is engaging in the cheat in order to have accelerated themselves, which has lost the actual contest in their own mind, posturing the cheating, which then creates the side effects of the social benefits, which is normal in any engagement of fighting over clients or sexual options or friend groups or the advancements in anything in particular. And thus, that mechanism of them having an old boys club, which is actively pushing out all of the competitors, is the confession by that old boys club to its own inferiority and the state that it has self-acknowledged itself as being too old to have engaged in the contest and fails immediately at that point. And thus, it as a collective organization must collapse and be replaced by the new generation, as the new generation is the only thing competent enough to engage in that contest as asserted by the forfeit. So they may not receive the benefits or profits from their crimes, as in a legal society, the only acceptable returns are the ones created legally, and thus all benefits from the cheating is immediately disqualified, and thus the colonizing white supremacists, from the assertion of their worship of Baphomet, has to be thrown out of the system in favor of the new bloods, which then has to receive the compensation by the satanic worshippers. engaged in their various dominatrix pedophilia, from their child stalking, such as, but it's not limited to, the ones who are sexually attracted to children using the government in order to engage in these abuses of various kinds, including the abuses in contests, so that their posterity, having forfeited by the abuses, can receive the benefits from the crimes, asserting a false sense of domination where it has not been earned, and thus confession to its own inherent inferiority. Changing the contest from the non-violent contests, where the higher energy discipline parties who would have acquired the position by their steady practice and dedication would be then subverted by the brutal subversions in the terrorist crimes, such as the hate groups who engage in extraordinary violence to have asserted their domination, nullifying the engagement of the practice that they would be competing in. And thus, in that activity, the standard social recipients in that market would consistently have a degraded value, as the discipline in the product no longer is the primary function, as it has been subordinated to the outside activity of the brutality from the mob tactic.